Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on which part of the world you are tuning in. My name is Eliza Tan. I'm Product Ecosystem Manager for Adobe's digital video and audio products. And we have today here Fergus Hammond and Katie from Sony. We have a very special treat for you today. And I'll hand it off to them to do some intros. Fergus, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience here?
Hey everyone, so my name's Fergus Hammond. I am a principal product manager on the video team at Adobe. I've been at Adobe a really long time, about 32 years actually this year, but I've only recently in the last couple of years been in the video team. It's actually been kind of my dream for a long time at Adobe to work on video products. So I focus on a few different areas. Performance is one. The team that is responsible for color in Premiere is part of my team. But for the purposes of this discussion today, I am also responsible for camera and codec support. So I'm the person that thinks long and hard about what cameras we support, how we support them, what we should focus on. And I am a giant camera nerd. So I am super excited to be here with Katie, whose videos I've watched many, many times as a fellow camera nerd. So I will pass it to Katie.
I'm super excited to be here with you guys as well. Thank you so much for having me. Everyone's been so nice and so supportive. It's been really nice. My name's Katie Eleneke. I'm a DP. I started interning at Sony in 2017. I jokingly say they couldn't get rid of me, so they had to start paying me. But my specialty is really kind of helping shepherd and training on cinema line cameras, and helping kind of people that maybe they're transitioning from FX3 to FX6, or a Venice DP who wants to also match an FX3 with their Venice. And so a lot of my job is kind of helping create like a safe space for a lot of the creatives that come in and have questions, and also answering questions about posts, like how can we help post supervisors and editors. As a DP and as a camera person, how can I help set up my camera so that way it makes posts a little bit easier? So I'm really excited to be here and be talking about those things.
Right, and we see in the chat people are joining us. Hey, Jack, Keys, Jess, Barbara, drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. We have Fergus and Katie here with us today, both experts at a Sony workflow in Premiere Pro. So I'll hand it off to them to walk us through what they have prepared for us.
We have so many things prepared. We have an hour,
so
right?
Little
I think
time.
we have an hour.
Yeah.
So little time. So little time.
Yeah.
So Katie and I were chatting before we started this about what we wanted to talk about, and there's kind of three big things we wanted to provide some insight to, things that we've had some questions from customers about, and then touch on a couple of other topics that are maybe a little bit more obscure, but also just make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A and chatting with you all. So the three things we wanted to chat about are just importing files. That is surprisingly tricky between Premiere and XOCN. It's one of those things that's super easy if you know how. So that's the first thing, just how to import files, XOCN files. And that's from any camera that shoots XOCN. That's the first thing. Second thing is applying a LUT. How to apply a LUT, how to do it the right way, how to install LUT. So a couple of things around LUTs. And then in-camera proxies, like many Sony cameras, the Sony Cinema line supports creation of in-camera proxies. So how do you use those in Premiere? So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So those are three things we'll do some demos of and talk about.
Amazing. And Jack, thank you for putting in the chat. For anyone who wants more information on how to best work with the Sony Burano, but also other cameras as well, there is an article that we've collaborated with Sony on. So for more answers, feel free to utilize that resource. Thanks, Jack, for putting that in the chat. And Fergus, if you want to talk a little bit about how we work with partners such as Sony as well.
Yeah.
And how our ecosystem really is so vast. And I think I recall like in 24.2 when we had rolled out support for Sony's Burano, but really the relationship with the Sony team has spanned decades even, right? And there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to ensure that there is this seamless workflow all the way from import to export. There's this seamless interoperability with our products and our software. Do you want to speak a little bit about that partnership and how that continues to drive innovation for us?
Yeah, totally. So a long time before I was in the video team at Adobe, but pretty much ever since there's been a Premiere, there's been people on the Premiere team talking to our camera partners, and Sony is super important, one of those partners. In fact, normally behind me on my shelf, you'd see Sony's famous skateboarding camera with the little, what's the wide angle adapter, Katie? The Century wide angle adapter that basically everybody bought who was making skateboarding videos. So I have one of those that's sitting around. So, you know, as most people know, Sony's got a giant range of cameras, and gosh, it was more than a year ago. I guess it was early last year. Our colleagues at Sony in Japan came to us and said, hey, we have something interesting coming out. We want to talk to you about it. And it was the camera that became the Burano. So actually, even before the Burano shipped, we had support for the updated version of XOCN that the Burano uses. We had support for a new format, XAVC HS, which is a highly compressed format using XAVC, an 8K format that is used by the Burano. And we had really good performance for those formats as well. So the partnership with Sony has been really long, and it's really close, and it's really fun anytime we get to meet our colleagues from Sony in the US and also Sony in Japan, which we do pretty regularly. So it's really important to us to make sure that we're not dictating what cameras our customers are using, but rather we're coming to our customers and their choice of cameras and making sure that the support for those cameras is really first class in Premiere. And that's certainly true of Sony formats, including XOCN and XAVC and all the different flavors of XAVC. So Sony's a super important partner, and we're really excited about the Burano. In fact, I don't think I mentioned this to all of you, but as soon as this is done, I'm actually gonna be jumping my car and driving. I'm in the Bay Area in San Francisco. I'm going to be driving to New Orleans to catch up with my in-laws, and I'm probably going to take our Burano with me, my Burano with its little Cooke SP3 lens on it. So I'll be on vacation with the Burano.
Nice.
I love that. Yeah, and that way, I think, Fergus, you summed it up so well, because that way we're thinking about like customers' end-to-end workflows, right? It's not just about post. We're thinking about pre-production all the way to post, and just enabling seamless workflows for customers. And had the privilege of meeting Katie, I think a couple times now in person as well, at NAB and one of our community town hall events as well, in LA. So it was amazing to meet some of the Sony team, the people behind just the amazing products that you make. And yeah, super excited. And we're getting comments in the chat and questions already, actually, about XOCN LT and XAVC, and some questions around proxy workflows as well. So if you all are good with it, I think we're ready to dive into the demo here. Yeah.
So do you want to, if you can cut to my screen, I just want to show kind of like a general format of all of the different codecs that are available in Burano, which encompass it's the first time one Sony camera has XOCN all the way to XAVC. And this is something that you can find online at sonyscine.com. If you ever want to, I like to screenshot it and keep it in my photo roll, because I don't remember all of this. That's crazy to think that one person could remember all of it. But basically, XOCN LT is a 16-bit linear format. It's recorded internally inside of the Burano. And then XAVC HI, HQ, and SQ are iterations that help wrap the full frame and higher resolution of 8K. And then the XAVC L and I wrap the 4K version, the 4K imager modes and things like that with Burano. So there's different codecs to help the camera sing, to give you the most bit depth and the most resolution, or depending on your project, it might give you the more efficient side for post-production, things like that.
There's a lot of formats. It's funny, when we were working with Sony and had a prototype camera, I think we had one of the 30 cameras that existed in the world at that time. I made my little Google spreadsheet with all the different imager modes and all the different formats, and there's a lot of different codecs the camera supports, but as Katie's saying, like there's different reasons to use each of those different codecs depending upon your use. Some of them, like Katie was saying, it's super small file size, but still, reasonable quality. Others like XOCN, much larger file size, but super, super high quality. Katie mentioned Sony Cine. Sony's got a great site. The Sony Cine website is really awesome. There's lots of white papers and sort of background information, and it's definitely a resource that I personally use for my job at Adobe. So I highly recommend our mutual Adobe Sony customers go check that out.
Yep.
So Katie, should we jump into talking about our first bullet point, how to import files? It seems like a basic thing.
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of people who ask this question, so I'm really excited.
Yeah, let's do it. So there's, before we started, I was counting the number of ways you can import media into Premiere. I think there's 4. So you can just go to File, Import, that's 1. You can click on oh, wait, there's 5. I forgot about the 5th. So you can go File, Import, go from there. You can click on the Import button here. You can go to the Media browser. You can double click on this pane. This is a thing that a lot of people don't know. You can just double click anywhere in the project panel to get to the import screen. But if you do any of those, and I'll actually go ahead and do one of those now. If you do any of those with XOCN, you may get a result that is not kind of what you're looking for. So here on my screen, you can see I've just made a couple of sort of bookmarks, favorites in the Finder to make this easier. This represents a card I copied from the Burano onto my computer. Here's the folder where all my XOCN is stored, and you can see there are 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever the number is. There's a bunch of clips here. So if I click on this, which is what I would normally do, click on the root of the folder, click on import, what Premiere is going to do, it's going to kind of do what you tell it to do versus maybe what you want it to do. Because what you're going to end up with is, for each of those folders that the Burano uses to store XOCN files, we will import the folder. So we'll preserve that folder structure. That's probably not what you want to do using XOCN, because you're probably going to have to click and drag these to move them around, make a smart bin maybe, but it's kind of a hassle. So the other way to do it, and this is the only one of those, what did I say, 5 ways? This is the only one of those 5 ways to get what is probably your desired result, and that is to go into the import mode. So Premiere has these 3 modes, import, edit, and export. So you go to the import mode. Again, go to that folder. I've made a little bookmark here for it. Click on the folder where all the XOCN is stored, and then click on import. And you can see what Premiere has done is just import the XOCN files without any of that folder structure. So if you're importing XOCN, whether it's from a Venice or a Burano, using the import mode is the way to go unless you want to do a lot of cleanup, which you probably don't want to do. So that's tip number 1. Super simple, but one of those things that a lot of customers have asked us about because it's not immediately obvious.
And Fergus, do you want to speak a little bit to, when importing XAVC or XOCN, the 2 formats are handled a little bit differently, right? Even if they're technically packaged in the same MXF container.
Eliza, that's a great point. Yeah, that's an awesome point. So as Eliza is saying, they're all, whether it's XOCN or XAVC, it's wrapped in the same container. But how we import it is a little bit different, and it's due to how Sony cameras are recording those files on disk. So if I go to import, go back to import, let me go find some test files. So these folders here, these again represent entire cards I've copied from the camera. So this is the root of a card. What you're looking at is a card that was used in my Burano behind me, where I was shooting both XOCN and XAVC. So you'll see these 2 folders. You'll see this one up here for XOCN, and you'll see this folder here for XAVC. So with XAVC, Sony stores all the XAVC files in a single folder. So it's a little different. So no matter how I imported, no matter which of those 5 import methods I used, you would get that desired result, right? Where all of your files, let's do it here. Actually, let's go back out here, go to edit, double click to import. Let's go, where are my test files? Sony footage, Burano test files, here we go. So there's that XD root file, and if I drill in a little further, you'll see that all of the XAVC files and their XML metadata, they're all stored in one folder. So I could just click on XDroot, for example, and I could just get everything. We'll get a bunch of errors because you're telling Premiere to try to import XML, but this is not the sort of XML we can import. So you'll see these errors. You can just ignore that. And now when you double click on this, you'll see all of the XAVC files in a single place. In a future version of Premiere, and it's actually in the beta right now, there are some additional options in the import screen to control whether we are preserving the folder structure or we're ignoring the folder structure. So that's been actually a long requested feature from customers. And that's for when you want to import a folder structure you've created, and you may want to deliberately import empty folders as bins that you then do something with later on. So that's a little bit about import. Eliza, anything else? I can't see the chat, of course. I want to see whether
yeah. Well, there are comments about the Burano that you have behind you. It's right there. And I think this is a question that, yeah, Fergus or Katie, whoever wants to take this. When should customers use a proxy workflow versus when it may not be necessary? And you might not necessarily have time to do one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a project that I wrapped a few months ago was a documentary. We were kind of in the middle of nowhere, meaning that we didn't have a lot of internet at our disposal. So I knew that when we came back, we had a week to turn the project around. And so I worked very closely with the editor to make sure that they could get footage ahead of time. So that way, by the time when I landed and I gave them the hard drive, that they could start cutting off of the XOCN. And so I did proxies because it is significantly easier to upload proxies to the cloud than it is to do the high-res XOCN. And that was something I did proxies in camera. And so as I was kind of double checking my footage, I had my raw footage going onto a hard drive as well as the proxies, but then I was only uploading the proxies at the end of the day. And that's something that I can show. Do we want to show how to kind of turn that function on in the camera? And then Fergus, we can talk about what it would look like in Adobe in Premiere.
Yeah, let's do it. That sounds great.
Okay, so if I cut to the side of the camera, this is in the camera itself. So I'm going to push and hold the menu button. Actually, I'm going to show you how I do that. So I push and hold the menu button to kind of get into what I call the deep menus. And then if I cut to the camera itself, I'm going to go to project. And then in base setting, I typically shoot in Cine EI mode. Everyone's different on their project and what they're delivering. And then right now I'm in XAVC SQ. This is just a kind of a random format that we chose. So instead, I'm going to go to XOCN because that's what my raw deliverable is. So I said hit execute. It's going to do a quick reboot. Thankfully, it only takes like a couple of seconds, like 12 seconds to reboot.
One of my favorite Burano features, how fast it is to reboot.
Truly.
Great.
So if I push and hold the menu button, I'm going to scroll down to project and select in. And my record format is at XOCN. If I keep going down to proxy, select in, and I turn that on. I will note, I have beta version software 1.1 currently. It's set to release in, I think it was like August, September. So just so everybody's got that in their brains. And then I can also, because this is the thing that I screw up the most for editors, I think, and that's why I very nice that I have a lot of editor friends who will work with me, especially when I'm like chaos on set and then trying to remember what channel, how do we plug in, what's it? So they typically like to have a scratch track of some sort. It's not always 1 and 2. So I would say just double check either with your editor or for yourself, know where you're sending your channels. So I'm going to just back out and kind of show that. So if I go to my audio, select in, my audio input. So my audio input 1 and 2 are currently my XLRs that are on the side of the camera, which are on the other side. So I've got the XLRs that are right here. So 1 and 2, but I can change that, right? So I can change that to 3 and 4 if I wanted, internal mic, as opposed to just if you want to scratch track, and that's it. So I'm going to back out, and that's how I set up my camera for proxies. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about something else that I did was they called them string outs. It was, again, another editor friend for a project. They said this is if you lay everything out onto a timeline based off of the proxies, and then they'll do an adjustment layer. I say they showed me how to do it because I was, again, in the middle of nowhere. So I kind of had to do it myself to upload for them. But they showed me how to turn on like the time code burn-in and the clip name burn-in and things like that. So that way, by the time they got it, they had all the information they needed and they could start cutting from the string out if they have to. It's not the best way to do it when you have to relink to the high res off of the string out. But it can be an easy way to identify and be able to communicate. The editor will say, hey, on day 2 string out, clip blah, blah, blah. Can you do that again? But the sun is like blasting into the shot. But it's a really great B-roll. Can you go grab it? And so then I know where to go back. It's a good way to communicate with them, especially, like I said, when you're just in a situation where you don't have internet or you don't have a lot of internet or you have a tight turnaround, things like that.
Yeah, there's some resonance in the chat with proxy workflows, editors saying that proxy is indispensable because they edit remotely now. So this is great. And I think that also more people are also starting to edit using original camera files directly in Premiere. So it's nice to have those options, right? To edit with proxies or without. There are some questions as well. Do you all want to talk briefly about H.264?
Yeah, let's actually come back, Liza, if it's okay with you, and talk just a little bit more about proxies, because Katie's given a great perspective, sort of how you set it up in the camera. So from our perspective, and particularly for me, I think a lot about performance, I think a lot about cameras and codecs. We want to make sure that we support both proxies workflow and a dailies workflow, but we're not dictating you have to use one. Meaning, we don't think that in general, you should have to use a proxy, whether it's a proxy you created in the camera or a proxy you created in post-production. We don't think you should have to use a proxy for performance reasons. There's lots of good reasons to use proxies. We're talking about transferring proxies over the internet. There's lots of good reasons to have a dailies workflow. That's super common for our higher end customers. But we don't want to force people to use proxies because they've got to do that for performance reasons. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last couple of years is hardware accelerating all of the common formats. And we've got a really good sense, because Premiere is sort of instrumented to give us this data. We've got a really good sense of what codecs and what cameras people are using. So we really prioritize like what we have to give the best performance to. And that's one of the reasons we spent a ton of time over the last year working with Sony to make sure that even 8K XAVC HS, and that's a super highly compressed, it's H.265, it's same as HEVC, same thing, super highly compressed format, but it plays back really well in Premiere. Now, there are some tricky things about using proxies in Premiere, and particularly with using in-camera proxies. So maybe we should flip over to my screen and we can just talk about that for a second. Okay, so first of all, this is like literally the most boring footage ever. My apologies. I was doing some time code testing. So this little device you see sitting on the chair in my attic, this is a thing called a time bar from our friends at Tentacle Sync. It's like a time code slate, but without the slate bit. It's just literally the time code, and it syncs to a little Tentacle Sync device that was plugged into the Burano behind me. So what you're looking at right now is this is a sequence where I've used the proxies from the camera. So the problem with Premiere right now, and this is definitely a bug, this is 1000% a bug, it's something aware of, it's something we're working on to fix, but today in the product, there's a challenge with using proxies that have a different number of channels of audio than the originals, right? So here I've got my proxy. If I was to right mouse button click on this proxy file, so I'll scroll over and you can see that this is, actually, let me just go revert, because I think I made the changes to this already. I do want to discard my changes. All right. So if I go to this file here, it is short stories. This is an HD file. Oh, this one's not an HD file. Okay, I'll just pretend. Yeah, go ahead.
Is XAVC hardware accelerated? Can it be edited and played back at full quality and resolution in real time?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends upon the computer. This is where we get into like super technical computer specs. It is fully on Apple Silicon computers, so XAVC. So when we talk about XAVC from Sony cameras, and for most of the customers that will be joining us for a session like this, we're generally going to be talking about XAVC that's 10-bit and that's 422, right? So those are the most common combinations of bit depth and chroma subsampling because they're the best quality. So that format on Apple Silicon is always hardware accelerated. It's hardware accelerated whether it's in MP4, it's hardware accelerated whether it's MXF. So on Windows, it's a little bit different. So on Windows, first of all, it doesn't matter what video card you've got. What matters is what sort of chip you've got, whether you've got an Intel chip or an AMD chip. If you've got an AMD chip, that format, that 10-bit 422 combination of XAVC and any AVC flavors for that matter, that is never hardware accelerated. And that's whether you're using Premiere, you're using Media Composer, you're using Resolve. It doesn't get hardware acceleration because the hardware does not provide it. Now, if you're using XAVC that is based on H.264 and you're using a recent Intel Core chip that has a technology called QuickSync, then it is hardware accelerated. That particular flavor is hardware accelerated. An HEVC version is not hardware accelerated. Okay, so my brain, and I think about this stuff all day long, is just about to explode because this stuff is so complicated.
I was just like, oh
our friends at Puget Systems make great Windows computers. They have a fantastic article about this issue. So if you do a search for Puget Systems and H.264 and Premiere Pro or any of the NLEs, they have a great article talking about what combination of Windows components do you need to get hardware acceleration. It's easy on the Mac right now. It's a bit more complicated on Windows. In Premiere's case, we hardware accelerate every place that we can based upon the hardware you've got. So short story, check the Puget Systems article. It's great. And most flavors of XAVC are hardware accelerated. Oh, that was a tough one.
That's great.
Okay, back to proxies. Let's sort of wrap up this conversation on proxies. So in Premiere, the challenge right now is that if you right mouse button click on a file and say proxy and say reconnect full resolution media, if you're attempting to reconnect to full resolution media that has a different number of audio channels than the proxy, it will fail. You'll just get an error message. Fortunately, there's actually another way to do it. So in this case, I'm actually just going to, I don't want to waste too much time here. Short story is that there's a different way to do it. We've got an article, actually the article that I think Eliza has shared in the chat. We've got an article about how to do this. You can, instead of using the proxy workflow in Premiere, you can simply go to the make offline option in Premiere. Make sure to leave the files on disk. So you can make the file offline, and then you can right mouse button click on link media, and you can link back to your OCF. So the scenario would be, backing up a little, scenario would be you've shot HD proxies on your Burano, you come into Premiere, and normally, and there's different, people have different opinions on the right way to do this, and there's no hard and fast rule. The way I would do it is I would get my HD proxies from the Burano. I would create a sequence in Premiere that is the same resolution as the original camera format. So let's say it's 6K from the Burano, right? I would set that proxy to the frame size of the sequence, so it fills up the entire frame. I would cut with my proxy, and then when I'm done and I want to switch to the original, let's say it's XOCN, 6K XOCN, I would use this workflow of disconnecting the media and then reconnecting the media to the OCF. So that gets around this problem in Premiere with proxies, this bug we have in Premiere that you cannot relink using our proxy workflow if you've got a mismatch in audio channels. Hopefully that makes sense. We've got a great document that we published recently in conjunction with Sony about how to do this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a lot of people that get that question. And one thing before we move on, I want to note was that the proxies are recorded via SD card. So just make sure you have an SD card plugged in there, and it just throughout, if you leave it in there, and that's typically what I do, everyone can do their own thing, but it just builds on top of it. And I never really format it until I absolutely have to. And I just keep the proxies kind of rolling onto that SD card.
My SD card of that is full of videos of my dog. My time bar on the chair in the attic is one test subject. The dog's running around in the yard of each test subject.
The best footage.
Eliza, we have the best footage. Best footage is dogs. They're cheap. They generally behave themselves. We had a third subject about what we're going to talk about. Oh, applying a LUT. How to apply a LUT.
Yeah.
But I want to check to see, Eliza, because I can't see the chat, whether there's any questions about the proxy stuff. Or heaven forbid, the stuff about hardware acceleration, which is
there actually is a little bit more about hardware acceleration.
Oh man!
But no, people have located the Puget article, so that's great. And yeah, before we move on from proxies, just a lot of resonance around that, because even when it comes to sharing files across production teams, not everyone has the necessary hardware to view XOCN files, right?
Yeah.
So that's proxy workworkflows are very relevant.
And they're great. Like I said, this one's just on an SD card, and I can throw it into my laptop. And at the end of the day, like worst case scenario, the director and I will just sit down and go through stuff, especially when we're doing doc, because in narrative, there's a whole other process and there's a whole other thing that we go through. But when you're doing like unscripted, or I mean, even if you're doing weddings, you're doing graduations, things like that, and you just want to review footage, and for live events, it's really nice to just have an SD card that you can look at really quickly and make sure that everything's there. It's very nice.
100%. Yeah, as someone who used to do weddings.
Weddings on a Burano. That's a fancy wedding. Wedding on a Venice.
That would be the most beautiful wedding ever. Yeah.
That'd be a cinematic.
So experience. Cinematic.
Yeah.
Hey, there's something I forgot to mention about hardware acceleration. I cannot believe I'm going back to talk about hardware acceleration at all again. And that is, today we don't hardware accelerate XOCN. That's kind of the bad news. But the practical kind of good news is that we do something working with Sony that's kind of clever in decoding XOCN. And that is that if you've got, again, some beautiful test footage from my attic, color chart here, my little metronome. If you're decoding, playing back, that is, XOCN footage, and you change this scale to half, we're actually doing something with the software we get from Sony to handle their files. We're actually only decoding half of that data. So we're not getting all of the data from the XOCN file during playback and trying to display that all at once. We're actually only decoding it half the resolution, or a quarter, or an eighth. So even on, an older computer, and with 8K XOCN, it might be surprising to a lot of our customers actually how good the playback is of XOCN, even though today it's not hardware accelerated. We are going to be adding hardware acceleration to it in the future, but our expectation right now is on a reasonably recent computer, people get good experience playing back XOCN at sort of half resolution.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think we are good to move on now to talking about how to apply a LUT the right way and how to make that always available in Premiere Pro.
Let's talk about LUTs for a little bit. So there are a couple things to know about LUTs with really any footage. This is not specific to the Burano or the Venice or Sony cameras, or really any camera at all, but it's more important for cameras that have got high dynamic range, like the Burano, like the Venice, and actually like a whole bunch of, in fact, I guess like pretty much all of Sony's cinema cameras have high dynamic range, have a lot of latitude, right? So typically, the way customers are really used to applying a LUT is, you can do an adjustment layer, you can do this a bunch of ways that are more efficiently, but just for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to click on the file, go into Lumetri color. Oh, let me back up a little. I forgot to mention that in a recent version of Premiere, we changed how we interpret XOCN. So if I was to double click on this file and click on source settings, you will see that, in the wrong screen, you'll see that we now do correctly read from the metadata in the file, the color space. Yeah, so this used to be always, no matter what you set in camera, Rec 709. And I don't know whether it's coming across in the Zoom session, that our interpretation of log into, or Sony S-Log3 into Rec 709 is really awful. So no customer should ever pick this from the pop-up menu. We used to default to it. We don't anymore, and probably in an updated version, we'll actually get rid of it entirely. So we do default. Whatever setting you've selected on the camera, we correctly default to, whether it's a Burano or a Venice, or even actually files from things like the F65 shooting Sony RAW, the older version of Sony's RAW format. So first thing, when you import the file, we do correctly recognize the color space as whatever setting you had on the camera. So back talking about LUTs. So sort of the typical way that people are really used to applying a LUT in Premiere is click on the file or maybe an adjustment layer, go into Lumetri, go into basic correction, and apply a LUT here. And you could browse to one, you can install it in the product. The problem with doing that on footage that has a lot of latitude is that the order of operations of our color pipeline is literally the way it appears in this screen. So we are, if you, for instance, change the exposure or the highlights, we're doing that after the LUT has been applied, which is not great. And it's something that in a future version of Premiere, you'll see a whole ton of this stuff change really dramatically, but that's a discussion for another time. So the problem right now is if you apply a LUT here, we apply that LUT, and then we apply the other operations, and that can actually end up clipping the image, which is not great on a camera like the Burano or the Venice that has a ton of dynamic range. So the better way to do it, and there's a couple of different ways to do it, but the simplest way to do it is actually just take advantage of this creative section of Lumetri and apply the LUT there. Because then, as we're processing the image through the color pipeline, any changes you make up here, say to highlights, will be applied, and then the LUT will be applied.
Right.
In a
There
lot
are
of
three
footage,
places in Lumetri where LUTs can be applied, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can apply at the input LUT, you can apply in the creative panel, you can also apply on the source footage itself, but that we can talk about at probably a different time or through some documentation. So simplest way to do this is just to apply the LUT here. So under Look, you can scroll down and choose Browse. If you wanted the Sony LUT or any other LUT to always appear in this menu, there's also a way to do that. So you can see right now, if I go to, where are we at? Creative, I get all these looks that have been in Premiere forever. And we will be changing this in a future version of Premiere to get a bit more up to date. I can add the LUT here, but it won't be in Premiere the next time I relaunch. So to do that, I can install the LUT permanently in Premiere so it will show up. Let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to get out of Premiere. And I think, Eliza, we have a document on how to do that, right?
We do.
So I've got two folders here. This is a folder on my hard drive where I've just got a bunch of LUTs I like using. Little sneak peek for the future. This is actually the set of LUTs that we would like to include in an updated version of Premiere for a bunch of common cameras. Over on the left-hand side, this is where Premiere stores its LUTs. So it's a fairly long way down on your hard drive. We have a common folder called LUTs. If you make a folder in here called Creative, I'm going to go copy my Sony LUT there. So if you make a folder there, copy any LUTs into that folder, and then relaunch Premiere. Oops, that is not Premiere, that is Preview. I got rid of my dock, and I have to go find Premiere. Okay, there we go. All right, if we relaunch Premiere, let's go and import another file. This one will do. That timeline. Okay, so now if I go to Creative, oops, got to click on the file. Now if I scroll down to the bottom, you'll see right down at the bottom of this menu is Sony SCAMA 3, Cine S-Log 3, and I can apply that LUT. So that's the way to, first of all, apply the LUT from the right place. So don't use basic correction if you've got footage that's got a lot of dynamic range. So number one. Number two, I showed you how to install a LUT in Premiere so that it'll be available every time you launch Premiere. And I think Eliza, there's I shared with Eliza a link to a document on our website about how to install LUTs.
And
so that's a little bit about how to use LUTs. Sorry,
And
Katie.
can I show my screen so that way I can show everyone where they can download like the latest and greatest LUTs that Sony has? So from my screen, I'm going to go to sonycine.com and I'm going to go to, you can click on LUT down here, or you can go to resources and you can go to tools. You can go LUT and art files, and then you can download from here. And these are all of the new LUTs, the Burano Cool, Teal and Orange, which I've really fallen in love with, Warm and Vintage. Those all come kind of preloaded inside of the Burano. But then for your editors, which happens quite often, especially if I'm preparing a hard drive from like doc stuff, I will put these LUTs on there as well that I used either for the proxies or what we were using to preview, to give them an idea of what we would like the look to kind of be around. And then we'll adjust in post once we get to the XOCN footage, because we might not bake this in, but it's just like a nice starting point, because a lot of directors don't typically like looking at log footage.
Yeah,
And
thanks,
you can
Katie.
spend a long afternoon playing with all of, or a long day actually, downloading all of the Sony LUTs on Sony Cinema, playing around with them. My dogs look great in orange and teal, I gotta tell you.
Yeah, right. And there's also these really nice low contrast ones that we like to use that are like a good base, like the low con base LUT is really nice. So you can start from there, and then you can start to really play with cyan and the shadows and maybe boost some of the saturation and the pinks and things like that. So this low con base LUT's a really good starting point. As well as some of these other look 1 and look 2 are also kind of on the lower contrast side. So it's just kind of like a wide range. And then some of the OG LUTs all the way down at the bottom are super creative looking, which are fun.
Lots of love around LUTs in the chat. Like Fergus mentioned, we did collaborate with Sony on an article that's linked in the description. So you'll be able to find out more information, and also what Fergus had demonstrated, the 3 ways to apply LUTs to your footage from within the Lumetri panel. That's also detailed in the article. There's a comment saying, I love you guys. Why you use color calibration charts.
Nerds, big nerds.
And
well, the truth is I use color calibration cards, but then not under controlled lighting. So I think I'm cool by using a card, but then my lighting is all, I should be sitting outside in the yard because the lighting is pretty consistent under the sun, but I appreciate the love for the calibration card.
And I'm cheating because I'm like in a whole like stage with a whole bunch of lights and all that. So I'm cheating.
Katie's showing off.
Such a cool.
Cool. Yeah, I'm a little jealous.
You're setting the standard for us.
Yeah.
Hey, Eliza, there's something we didn't mention. Maybe we could flip back to my screen share. This is another little sort of sneak peek here. So this is that same very exciting shot of my attic. This dialog box, or this panel over here, is a little bit sparse. We're looking at XOCN. One of the things I hear a lot from Sony customers shooting XOCN is, hey, Adobe, it's RAW. Where are the RAW controls? We'd like to change tint. We want to change temperature. We want to
There's actually a question about that in the chat too. Will Adobe open up more RAW options?
You already know.
XOCN the color gamma.
So the answer is we don't have a date, but it is something we've started working on. And my, as a product manager, I write things we call PIDs, product requirement descriptions. And pretty much the PID for this feature in Premiere is, hey, make it work like the Sony RAW app, which gives you the ability to tweak all of those controls. And also, one of the things that I haven't seen in other NLEs that we definitely are planning on supporting is Cine EI. So not just showing what ISO setting you had in the camera, but also whether what setting you had for Cine EI in the camera. So temp, let's see if I can get this right. ISO, Cine EI, temperature, and tint. Did I get that right? So 4 controls. Anyway, short answer is yes. We understand that one of the best reasons to shoot in RAW is that you can modify things in post that perhaps you made a mistake in production. So we definitely are planning on doing that for XOCN.
Awesome. Well, there's definitely excitement around that. We do have about 10 minutes remaining. With the time that we have remaining, do we want to chat about multi-channel audio or how, what do you all want to cover next?
Is there any other questions in the chat that might have come up?
Yeah. I think we've addressed most of them. So I think we're good to move on.
Eliza, maybe one of the things I find really useful for, I think, all of these topics is Adobe's best practices guide around episodic.
Yes, we've put that in
and long
the, there were some questions earlier about narrative workflows, and I've put that in the chat. The long form and episodic workflow guide, right, Fergus? That's what you're referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, and just for folks who haven't seen that, that is, again, putting on my, or leaving on my nerd hat here. It's super interesting reading and is really the culmination of kind of everything Adobe's learned over the last, gosh, I guess about 10 years, like from when we said, hey, when is Premiere going to get used to cut an Oscar winner, to now. It's all of those things we've learned about, what to do, and also some stuff like what not to do in Premiere, like don't use merge clips if you're going to be doing audio or VFX or color turnovers, a whole bunch of stuff about what to do and some stuff to avoid in the product. It's super useful, and I definitely encourage anybody who's doing long form or episodic work to go check it out.
Yeah, there's Kenneth says, reading my mind. Thank you for plugging the best practices guide. Are there, yes, the links are in the chat to the best practices, the workflow guide. There's a helpx on LUTs. There's a link in the chat as well to Sony's LUTs as well on their landing page. Thanks, Jack, for helping out with those links. Good to see some more familiar names in the chat as well. If any other questions come up, please feel free to input them. We have Fergus and Katie with us today, who will be able to answer them live. See if any more questions on LUTs. We have some questions on audio channel numbers. So what are best practices there when audio channel numbers there may be some mismatch?
Yeah, so from the camera side, the camera proxies are just 2-channel, and the XOCN is 4-channel. I believe an XAVC is 8-channel. And if Simon's watching, he can maybe come walk out here and confirm or deny that. But that being said, when you're trying to relink things in post, that's why Fergus was alluding to having to unlink and relink in that way, just because of the different number of audio channels available. For Burano, you can get 4 channels of audio. You can do 2 via the XLRs. And then the other 2 are something that can be unlocked if you use like an FX9 handle and you use the MI shoe that comes out of that. The MI shoe has 2 channels, and Sony has an audio lavalier receiver, and it'll do dual. So you can have 2 lavs coming into one receiver, and it'll bake that audio in. So 4 channels out of the camera.
Amazing. Katie, what are some more tips and tricks that you have to share based on your interactions with editors on just filming with tight turnarounds?
I mean, filming with tight turnarounds, a lot of it is, especially when we're doing multi-camera and we've got a lot of stuff, is help staying on top of naming your cameras, formatting your cards, time code, jamming time code, and making sure that that's always together. Editors really don't like to resync things manually, especially because Premiere has such a great relinking going on inside of its engine. So I think I would say that's probably the best tip I can give you. And one of the things with Burano, which I can show you, just if I go to the inside of the camera menus, and I'll push and hold the menu button, and I'm going to scroll to time code and media, and I select in. This is where my time code is. I recommend you go to preset and go to free run. And typically editors like to have time of day. And that's when I say time of day is like, whatever the actual time of the day is, that the time code sets that itself. And something that's super fancy about the Burano is that I can also do time code out. And sometimes that is something that we have to do. These are all things that I used to be deeply afraid of as a DP, and then projects have kind of changed as time went on. And so now I feel really comfortable. If you're taking time code in from a mixer, then obviously you want the switch up. And if you're spitting it out, which is really nice because I'll have, like, if I have a Burano and a Venice and an FX3, I might do out time code on my Burano into the FX3 and into the Venice as just it's something that I've always have in my back pocket, which is really nice to have. So, and then if I go back to the camera menus, so if you wanted to do clock, right, that's how you could do, and then you could do time code out from there. But if you're taking it in, it's easier to do preset and free run, and then clip name format. A lot of the time, I'll just put K because I'm Katie, and then everybody knows that it was my camera. I know that's also not normal. Usually it's A, but then when you have a lot of cameras, everybody puts A on everything. It gets a little confusing because then you have a lot of A cameras. So sometimes I'll do my letter, and then you can change your camera ID in real. So then it'll say K001 and then 2, and it'll go up from there. So.
Yeah, there's some comments in the chat about saying that you're right. That's editors don't often have all the time in the world. And so the Burano, it records up to 8K resolution, right? With multi-channel audio. While also recording proxy files. There's interest around the long form and episodic best practices guide. We have just 4 minutes left.
4 minutes.
Is there any
we
final?
Talk about 4 minutes.
Time has flown. Any final tips and tricks, or what's upcoming really with the Sony and Adobe partnership?
Secrets. All secrets.
Yeah,
more
all
cameras,
secrets.
more Premiere.
Oh, I have a question that might be easy to solve in 4 minutes, 3 minutes. Desqueezing anamorphic footage in Adobe. I get that question a lot as well.
Let's do that. And there's also a question about how colors hold up for skin tones.
Katie, I can talk about desqueezing. Do you want to talk about colors and the lovely Sony colors that are now much lovelier than they used to be?
Yeah. If you want to talk about, you do desqueeze, and then I'll kind of quickly go over skin tone stuff. Yeah, real quick on desqueeze, and this is one of those things, if somebody can follow up with me, welcome to. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram and all the usual places. I believe, and I literally gave my anamorphic lens yesterday to a colleague of mine. He came over and picked it up. He was very excited. Hi, Eric, if you're listening. We should read the metadata in XOCN when you specify on the camera that you're using an anamorphic lens. Like I've forgotten what it's called on the Venice Sony, on the Sony cameras. Katie, maybe you can remind me, like the desqueeze factor. So we should read that. So we should automatically desqueeze it in Premiere. If we're not, reach out to me and let me know. That's one of the things we regularly
Chat says
test for.
anamorphic, yay.
Okay, yeah, cool. I think one of the big things I know on the Sony side is that there's updates to get 1.5 desqueeze out of the camera in the 1.1 version drop that's coming in just a couple months, because as soon as Burano came out, everybody wanted to put Atlas Mercuries onto the Burano. And so that was something that the engineers were like, and we'll add 1.5 immediately. So we'll get that super soon.
Amazing. And did you want to talk about skin tones real quick, Katie?
Yeah, that's such a, I don't know what the question was exactly, but
how colors hold up for skin tones.
I think if you can share my screen, this is kind of one of the things that I can give you kind of like the best tips and tricks, because I think one of the questions we get is, how is it with skin tones? And when you talk about SDR, HDR, why is there an sgamut3.cine and then an sgamut? Essentially, slog2 sgamut came, and then there was an slog3 sgamut3 that was mo better at handling 10-bit and things like that. And then, colorists had some input and they wanted to make some changes. And so then our color scientists went back and they kind of came out with slog3 sgamut3.cine. So if we look at my screen and we look at this super cool triangle, the sgamut3.cine in red, right? This is for standard dynamic range. If we look at this gray triangle, that's P3. that's what the color space you'll typically see for like theatrical deliverables. And then 709 is something that most people, when you hear it, you're quite familiar with. It's just kind of like an antiquated standard at this point, but a standard nonetheless. As you can see, all those triangles kind of fall into each other, kind of like nesting dolls. And then if I pull up my S-gamut 3, S-gamut triangle, my yellow, notice this green triangle that's 2020, which is associated with HDR. It's called 2020 because it's a color space that was originally going to be introduced in 2020, but it ended up coming out a little bit earlier. But notice those are like kind of nesting dolls, that those fall into one another. And so some recommendations that we'll give people, that if you're delivering a project in HDR, it might be easiest for you or your colorist or whoever to be able to manipulate that color into a HDR color space, as opposed to if you're doing an HDR deliverable, which most of us are, it might be a little bit easier, and there might be less like interpolation essentially happening if you were to go from an S-gamut 3.8 to 709. When we talk about it all together and we kind of reference skin tone and things like that, if you look at this yellow triangle, S-gamut 3 versus our red triangle, S-gamut 3.cine, notice that the S-gamut 3.cine is a little bit skewed, and it's skewed even a little bit more, it's skewed a little bit more towards skin tones, essentially, kind of those reds and those oranges. And this is something that other DPs have kind of noted. And so that's what I would say, the rendition on skin tones and things like that, because skin tone's so important, Sony cameras and color space kind of cover all of that. And they do a really good job. But just notice the different color spaces might make a difference when you're applying LUTs in Premiere.
Amazing. And on that note, we are at time. I know there were some questions that didn't get answered, but we have a link to the article in the chat for best practices working with Burano and Sony Cinema line of cameras with Premiere Pro. We do have hundreds of partners in our ecosystem. There are so many teams behind the scenes, Fergus and the formats team being a really crucial one. So I've put in the link in the chat too to our partner website where you can read more customer stories and articles on these partner-enabled workflows. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Fergus and Katie, for tuning in.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so
Thanks,
much for
Katie.
having me. Thank you, Fergus.
Bye, everyone.